there's this cave woman. And outside of cave woman's cave is a plant. And cave woman, over a period of time, lasting somewhere between a year and 10,000 years, has come to the realization that she and her family are in some way dependent upon this plant because it produces food. And she and her family need food to survive. So she has come to the realization that she is dependent upon this plant that produces food outside of her cave. But she has come to this observation that the plant is itself dependent on these forces that are beyond the plant. And so there is this ball of fire that travels at regular intervals through the daytime sky. And if this ball of fire burns too hot, it singes the plant, it saps its life force, and the plant is unable to produce food, which she and her family are dependent upon. Also, from time to time, there is water that falls from the sky. Sometimes she can tell when it's going to fall. Other times, it happens very unexpectedly. And this water, if too much of it falls, it washes the plant away. If not enough of it falls from the sky, the plant dries up. And so she comes to this realization that the plant is dependent upon these forces beyond itself, and she is dependent upon the plant. So she is, in some very troublesome way, dependent upon these forces that are beyond her control. Now, cave woman has a cave husband. And cave husband likes to hunt when he is not selling auto insurance. And so cave husband leaves with the other cave husbands, and sometimes they're gone just a few hours and they return with the kill. Other times they go on a hunt and they are gone for days and they return exhausted, sometimes with the kill, sometimes empty-handed. And what the cave husbands do when they return from the cave husband hunt is they tell stories about the hunt, and cave woman eavesdrops. And she has discerned over time that their stories about the hunt have a certain theme to them because they speak of how this particular animal, we pursued it, and it was as if it wanted to fall victim to us. We were gone for a couple of hours, we found it, we pounced upon it, and we brought back the kill. Other times, this particular beast, we chased it for days. We went over the mountain, we went across the river, we went through the woods, and we could not capture it. They speak of the elusive nature of this particular animal. And over time, they even use words like spirit of the hunt because they are unable to control this fundamental primal spirit of the hunt. Sometimes they can just pounce upon the animal and they're home in a couple hours. Other times they're gone for days. Sometimes they even return empty-handed. And so when cave woman listens in on the cave husband's hunting stories, she realizes that her understanding of the plant, her relationship with the plant and dependence upon these forces beyond herself is very similar to the stories that her cave husband tells about the hunt. Now, cave woman has also observed that not only is there this ball of fire that moves through the sky in regular intervals, but there is a ball of light that travels through the night sky. And the ball of light, sometimes it's a full circle in the night sky, and then it moves thinner and thinner until it's almost like a crescent shape, and then it moves back into a full circle. And this cycle of the shapes of the ball of light in the night sky is directly related to 30 appearances of the ball of fire in the daytime sky. And over time, she's also come to this realization that her body and the internal workings of her own body are in some way on some sort of 30-day cycle rhythm. Watch how articulate I am. And so she's come to this realization that there's something about the whole way her insides are wired that is somehow related to the movement of this ball of light in the night sky. And she and cave husband have come to see that if the ball of light is in the proper place in the sky and they begin to feel a certain way towards each other, often involving candles and a bottle of wine, and they act on these feelings that they have towards each other, and if they take these feelings and they actually pursue them to their consummation with literally their physical bodies, that what happens if that ball of light is in the proper place in the sky, she discovers that something literally takes root within her. There's some sort of growth that begins. New life begins to grow. I mean, she understands a plant growing from the earth, but there's some way in which new life begins to literally grow up from within her, to the point at which her body can no longer sustain and hold in this bursting new life, and it literally comes out of her, and she has a brief moment to celebrate that it looks a little more like her than him. And there is this moment, though, this moment of terror, when this new life first bursts forth from her, because she and her husband, there is this primal life force that surges through them, this in and out, that if you lose this in and out, whatever it is that comes in and comes out with this rhythmic breathing, if you lose this, you are dead. And essentially the primal life force has left you. And so there is this brief moment of terror because this new life does not come immediately with this pulsating rhythmic life force coming in and out. And so they have to do everything they can to make sure that it gets this life force. Sometimes she'll take her own lips and place them to the lips of this new life and try to impart her life force and give it essentially to her newborn child. And there are moments when the child begins to cough and then it begins to breathe and they celebrate. But there have been moments when she has held new life and it has not been able to obtain this primal rhythmic life force. And in those moments, as she held a lifeless child in her arms, she is reminded of the simple truth that she is dependent upon these forces that are beyond her control. Whether it's the plant, the hunt, the ball of light in the night sky, the growth within her insides, all the way to new life itself and the primal life force that pulsates through every alive human being. She comes to this terrifying awareness that there are these forces that are beyond her control. Now, over time, people began to name these forces because it hasn't rained. So obviously, whatever the force is that drops the water from the sky, well, that force must be busy somewhere else. It must be upset with us. It must have poured out all of its buckets, and it must be going around looking for something new to put in its bucket. Or there's a disease among our flock. Well, obviously, the force that controls the health of our animals, it must have failed. It must be angry. It must be at war somewhere else. And so over time, people began to personalize these forces, and they began to name them and ascribe to them personalities. Among the ancient Mesopotamians, in one of the first cradles of civilization, El was the father god, Sham was the sky god, Baal was the god of lightning, Yam was the god of waters, and Nin-Hersog among the ancient Sumerians was the mother goddess of fertility, and An was the heaven god, and Enlil was the god of water, Enki the god of air, and they had Nana, the god of the moon, and Utu, the god of sun and justice. Give it up for Utu. Among the Babylonians, Marduk was the god of thunder. There's even the ancient Greeks. This is brilliant. The Greeks had a goddess named Artemis. Artemis was the mother goddess who was the goddess of hunting. Not only was she the goddess of hunting, she was also the goddess who was the protector of small animals. To which I say, that you get one or the other. Hey, little buddy, come here. Oh, that's so sad. And the ancient Sumerians, literally 3,000-4,000 years ago in the ancient Near East, one of the first civilizations to ever emerge, the ancient Sumerians had a god of beer. Somebody always claps at that. Her name was Ninkasi. Ninkasi, the goddess of beer. You can find worship songs to to the goddess Ninkasi of beer that are thousands of years old. People would gather to sing to her. One of them goes, "She is born of sparkling fresh water. She is the lady who fills the mouth. She bakes with lofty shovel the freshly sprouted barley. She mixes the sweet aromatics. She pours the fragrant beer in the latten vessel, which is like the Tigris and the Euphrates joined." The next time you have a party, tell people, okay, let me tell you how serious we are about this party. It's going to be like the Tigris and the Euphrates joined. Okay, that's how serious we are about this party. So you can walk across the ages, across time periods, across historical groups, across geographical areas, across worldviews and perspectives, and you can find this naming of the gods and goddesses and the deities, and this sense that these are these personalities, these forces that we are in some way down here on planet Earth dependent upon. Now, over time, you can see how people drew the conclusion, what we need to do is we need to keep these forces on our side. We need to keep their favor. We need to keep the rain coming in just the right amount. We need the ball of fire to burn just hot enough, but not too hot. We need whatever those spirits or forces are that allow us in the ultimate act of survival to make more of us, to give us the ability to make more of us. And so, over time, somebody proposed the idea, here's what we ought to do in order to keep these forces appeased and happy with us, is the next time we have a crop, let's not consume all of the crop, but let's take a portion of the crop, and instead of either eating it, consuming it, or storing it, let's take a portion of the crop and let's set it aside. And that way, what we'll do with it is we'll literally offer it to the forces. And that way, then the forces will see that we're grateful. As almost like sending a message to the divine being. See, we understand where it comes from, and we want to honor and worship. We're so grateful. We would never want you to think that we take it for granted. And so the idea emerged of taking a portion from your flock, a portion from your vineyard, a portion from the plant, and take it and essentially offer it. Now, obviously the forces are up, because the rain comes from up, the sun, the moon, the stars are up, the wind seems to come from up, and obviously when you're dead, you go down, so we ought to offer this in some physical way up. And so over time, the idea emerged of the altar, oftentimes on a mountaintop, but some physical place, generally a pile of rocks, that you would place things on as a way of essentially offering them up to the forces who you are totally dependent upon. And so, as this idea became centralized, there became these piles of rocks that were the places that you went. Oh, you're in that region. And you're experiencing a disease within your cattle. I'll tell you, the area that you're talking about, there is a God there who oversees the cattle. And here's what you ought to do. Go to that God's temple, because that God's priests will tell you essentially how to make amends with that God so that God will smile upon you. And so, oh, it's not raining for you. Oh, got it. The rain goddess in that region is particularly temperamental, but if you go to her temple, to her altar, they'll show you how to keep her happy. You'll come, you'll do this. Priests arose around this time, people who are experts in saying, oh, here, do these 4 things, and then that force will be in your favor. And so this idea of the offering emerged into the idea of a sacrifice, and further emerged in the idea of the altar. And so this took place over obviously thousands and thousands and thousands of years. But now, the altar had a fundamental flaw. Imagine if things go extremely well for you. Imagine if you've had like 3 times the harvest. Well, if I go and I offer the gods the same amount that I offered last year, I might offend them. The gods may say, wait. You offered the same amount last year, and this year we gave you 3 times as much, and you're still offering the same amount. Don't you understand that we have provided extra for you? So if things go really well, I have to offer more because I would never want the gods and goddesses to think I've taken this for granted. If things went well, you're stuck offering more. But let's say things go poorly, things go bad. Let's say there's a drought and there's a famine. It has not rained. It has not rained for 6 months. Well, obviously, we have offended the rain god. So you would come and offer something to the rain god. But let's say it's 8 months, 10 months, 12 months, and it still hasn't rained. Well, obviously, the last time we came and offered something, it wasn't enough. So I need to offer more. So it's 12 months, and we come and we offer more. But let's say it hasn't rained, and it hasn't rained, and it hasn't rained, and it's 14 months, 16 months, 18 months of drought. Obviously, all those previous sacrifices did not appease the gods. Apparently, we simply did not offer enough. We need to offer more. The vicious cycle, the vortex that was the altar, was if you have things go really well for you, then you come and you need to offer more. If things go poorly, if it hasn't rained now in 2 years, well, obviously, I need to offer more. So with the altar, you never knew where you stood. You lived with this sense, somebody somewhere, are they offended? Are they angry? That was a good thing that happened, but I need to make sure that they know that I know that that was a good thing. And so the altar produced in the primal psyche of the first humans, and as it essentially emerged over the years, produced a deep, deep anxiety in the bones of humanity, because you never know where you stand with the gods. Well, I've offered all of my crop, except a little bit, and if I offer that, then we'll starve right away. And I've offered everything from my flock to make sure the gods are on my side, and if I offer this one animal left, well then we'll starve in the next week. So I've offered everything of my possessions that's valuable. What's left to show the gods how grateful I am? The prophets of Baal in the land of Canaan, 4,000 years ago, would cut themselves as a way of shedding their own blood to show the gods, to show the forces. See, we are this devoted to you. Please understand, to earn your favor, I am even going to shed my own blood so that you will be appeased. I mean, I've given everything I have. All that's left is to essentially harm my body in a way that will show you just how deeply devoted I am to keeping your favor. There was a goddess named Kibbalah who emerged out of Asia in roughly 500 BC. She merged with some goddesses from the West, and the cult, the religion of Kibbalah grew and grew and grew in Asia Minor, which is present-day Turkey. Kibbalah was a mother goddess. She was also called the many-breasted one, family show. And Kibbalah was the one who was eternally procreating on your behalf. You got a paycheck? Kibbalah. You've been able to have lots and lots of children? Obviously, Kibbalah has blessed you. Your crops are tripling and quadrupling every year. Must be Kibbalah, because she is the mother goddess who is perpetually reproducing on your behalf for your blessing. Now, the religion of Kibbalah was fascinating because Kibbalah was a female deity. Now, if you were a man, this puts you in an awkward position because you wanted to show the female deity how devoted you were to her, but you're not a female, you are a male. And so there is historical evidence that the ultimate sign of devotion to Kibbalah, if you were a man, is you would castrate yourself in a religious ceremony in order to show your identification with the mother goddess. Gentlemen who are squirming, very normal response. There is evidence at the spring festival in the city of Sardis, Asia Minor, that in a frenzy of devotion and worship, somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 men castrated themselves and then placed their former maleness on the altar of Kibbalah as a sign of devotion. Sardis, known for their choirs. Who wants to sing the high part? Pick me. I was actually there, and we were hiking with this historian who has done years of research into all this, and we were at Sardis, and partway up the mountain is the original altar to Kibbalah. It's a pile of rocks, and it's still standing to this day. So we've been hiking for days on end, and we hiked partway up the mountain. We came to this pile of rocks, not knowing what it was, and the people are just exhausted, and a couple of the hikers like kind of just kick back there, just letting the feet rest. And so this historian is giving this lecture. There is a significant historical fact that several thousand years ago in the spring festival of the goddess Kibbalah, 4,000 to 5,000 men castrated themselves in a sign of worship and devotion to the mother goddess, and then placed the family jewels on the altar as a sign of devotion. And there's this moment when the guys are like, awkward. Archaeologists were excavating the great Aztec temple of Tenochtitlan, and they dug up the remains of 42 children who the Aztecs offered to their gods. Because if you have to keep offering something that's more and more and more valuable, well, eventually you end up at what? I've offered my flock. I've adjusted, if that's the word, my body. What more do I have? My firstborn. Now do you know how devoted I am? When 16th century Spanish colonizers first engaged with the Incan culture, they discovered that the Incans had a practice called capacocha. They would take a live child, wrap it in like a burial cloth, and the burial cloth would suffocate the child as they offered the child to their gods to appease the forces and the powers, because they believed they were totally dependent on these forces, and what you must do is give that which is most valuable to the gods to make sure they aren't upset with you. In the Hebrew scriptures, you can find several references to the detestable god Molech. Why was Molech detestable? Because Molech demanded your firstborn. And so there are stories of the followers of Molech offering their firstborn children in the fire in the valley of Hinnom on the south side of the city of Jerusalem as a way of appeasing the detestable god Molech. The problem with the altar is it was like this slippery slope. You have to keep offering more. And so deep in the collective psyche, the conscience of humanity, for thousands of years has existed this primal sense of fear, worry, stress. I don't know where I stand with these forces that I am dependent upon for my very survival. Now, history tells another story about these powers as well. If you've ever been trapped in a hotel room and someone named Gideon was there first, you have come across the biblical narrative. Now, the story of the Bible is fascinating because it's not detached from time and space. It's not a story that's told over here, but it's a story that comes up from within and is woven in among these very cultures we've already been exploring. So like the 12th chapter of the Bible begins with a story about a man named Abraham. Now, this story first was an oral tale. It emerged over hundreds of years as it was passed on and passed on. Eventually, a long time later, somebody actually wrote it down. But at first, it was a story that came about from within culture. Now, this story of Abraham emerged among Sumerian civilization. And the story begins, there's a man named Abraham who heard some sort of divine voice. And this divine voice said that he should leave his father's household and go to a new place. And then this divine voice said, I'm going to bless you, and then you essentially will bless people to the ends of the earth. Well, wait. A divine voice that a human being could interact with, could hear, could in some way connect with. Everybody in that day understood that the gods and goddesses, the forces, are somewhere else. Well, what? They're somewhere else. They do whatever they do up there or out there somewhere, and then we're left to kind of respond down here in actual space and time to whatever moods they're in or to whatever they happen to be doing. This story said and claimed that a divine, some sort of divine disembodied voice, some sort of God, connected with a human being in such a way that a human being could actually. This God invades actual human history and time and space to connect with a human being. This was an absolutely brand new idea in human history. And the voice says, leave your father's household. Well, when we hear father's household, we think, cable, grill, garage door. I mean, father's household, yeah. No, your father's household. Your father was the one who taught you how to navigate the forces. Your father taught you, oh, you need it to rain? Here's how you get the rain god on your side. You're having trouble because your flock has some sort of disease that you can't quite cure. Well, that particular illness comes from this particular deity who is appeased in this way. Your father and your father's household was your father's idols, your father's gods. How your father taught you to navigate these forces, to keep them on your side so that life would go well with you. And this voice says, leave the whole old way you've done things and come into a whole new reality. Well, the Sumerians believed that essentially history was cyclical. You're doing what your father did, what your father did, what your father did, and tomorrow will essentially be another repeat of yesterday. And so history moves in cycles. This story, right away in the first few words, says, leave behind that whole old way you know that things work and come and step into a whole new tomorrow that is totally unlike yesterday. These were absolutely revolutionary ideas in the human history. No one had ever proposed them. There are even these ancient Jewish stories that are essentially stories made up to comment on the radical nature of these stories about people like Abraham. One of them is a story that the rabbis would tell about the night that Abraham was getting ready to leave his father's household. They say that Abraham went into the main room of his father's house where his father kept all his statues that represented all the gods and goddesses. And they said that Abraham went in, he took an axe and smashed to pieces all of his father's gods and statues except one. And then he took the axe and put it in the hands of the one remaining idol. Then, the next morning, Abraham's father comes in. All of his gods are smashed all over the floor except for the one remaining one, which is holding the axe. And Abraham's father says, what has happened here? To which Abraham responds, I think it's quite clear what's happened here. To which Abraham's father responds, no, this can't be. These are lifeless idols. I carved them myself. I made them out of brick and stone and wood and marble. They're just lifeless idols. To which Abraham responds, then why do you bow down to them? Which is the first instance in history of somebody doing this. So, no idea what that means. I don't know. So there are these endless stories of the unbelievably progressive, innovative nature of a God who steps into human history and says to somebody, leave behind the whole worldview, the whole old way you've done things, and step into a new tomorrow. And then this God says a couple chapters later to Abraham, says, go outside, look up at the stars. Abraham looks up at the stars, and this God says to Abraham, okay, you see these stars? Your children and your descendants are going to be as numerous as the stars. Well, actually, in the culture in which this story was first told, the Sumerians worshipped the stars. They even had a particular god of the sun. This god's name was Shemesh. This god uses the other gods as props to make a point in the stories this God is telling. This is absolutely mind-blowing. And then eventually, Abraham has a son. Father Abraham had many sons, and many sons had Father Abraham, and I am one of them, and so are you. And we've got that going for us. And so Abraham has a son. And in Genesis chapter 22, it says that God says to Abraham, take your son, your only son, whom you love. Now, this is the first mention of the word love in the Bible. take your son, your only son whom you love, and go to the region of Mount Moriah and offer your son as a sacrifice there. And so Abraham loads up his son and takes a servant and heads out to this mountain, a high place, and goes to offer his son, has the knife out to sacrifice his son to this God. A divine voice of some sort says, wait, don't do it. Stops him at the last minute from offering his son. And then this divine being says, actually, there's a ram caught in a thicket over there. Come and bring that ram instead. And the story ends with, see, God provides. Now, if you've ever read the Bible, if you're still stuck in a hotel room and Gideon was there first, and you've gotten to this point in the story, you're thinking, what an odd story. It's tragic. Somebody call Child Protection Services immediately. Oftentimes when people first read stories like this, there is this kind of like, oh, okay, this is the reason religion is so destructive. I mean, offer your son as a way to prove to the God that you are essentially a good, faithful person. I mean, flannel graph that. And oftentimes this is the problem with religion. It's so regressive. It holds people back. I mean, is there a religion behind door number 2? I don't. And oftentimes among Christians, Abraham was such a good man. And there are scriptures that speak of the greatness of Abraham. But if you're reading it for the first time, yeah. But if he's great, the reason he's great is because he was willing to kill his son? I don't get it. A couple observations from the story. How come when Abraham is first told, offer your son, Abraham doesn't say, no. And he doesn't say, how? He apparently knows how to do this. Why is Abraham not shocked with the idea of a divine being offering that which is most precious and valuable to you? Because this is how the gods are. They demand. The gods demand the thing that is most valuable to you. So Abraham, of course, because he's a person of his day, just goes about heading out to do it. And then he gets there, he's about to offer his son, and God says, stop. Now, why is this? Is this God making a point? Is the whole thing a prop? Abraham, you are used to gods who demand the thing that is most valuable to you. Stop. And then this God says, offer an animal instead. Is this a whole new day? Because the story does not end with the greatness of Abraham. It ends with a statement about this God. This God provides. If we stop at the point where Abraham doesn't go through with it, we miss that perhaps what the storyteller is saying is, it's a whole new day. Your fundamental human posture is, what do I have to give the gods? But this story ends with a God not only who blesses, but a God who provides. A story about a God who provides instead of you having to provide was an absolutely revolutionary idea in human history. No one had ever presented a God like this. Now, if you're still trapped in a hotel room, and someone named Gideon was there first, and you get to the 3rd book of the Bible, you stumble across a lovely little tome called Leviticus. If you've ever read Leviticus, well done there. If you've ever read Leviticus, especially the first 5 chapters or so, you find yourself thinking things like, oh my goodness, this is like a B-grade slasher film with no plot. It's just how to kill things, chapter 2, how to kill more things, chapter 3. Here's what to do when you kill things. If you read it for the first time, you think to yourself, how regressive, how backwards. But we have to remember that this story did not emerge outside of human time and space, but emerged within human history. Leviticus begins by outlining 5 specific sacrifices. In the Hebrew language, they're called the Olah, the Minha, the Shelamim, the Hatah, and the Asham. Now, the first one, it says, come near to God. Well, wait. The gods are distant. The gods are somewhere else. And this book begins, come near to God. It then says, come near, gives instructions, offer an animal, so a bull, a goat, a sheep, a bird, offer something, and then the sacrifice is over. Or, number 2, the minha, offer some sort of grain, offer something from your crop. And then the third sacrifice, the third offering, is called the shelamim. It comes from the Hebrew word shalom, which means peace or harmony. The shelamim offering was where you'd put something on the altar, the rest you would keep, and you would prepare a feast for your family and friends. And then you would have a feast in which you would celebrate the peace that you have with God. Well, wait. Everybody at this point in human history lived with this awareness that you never know where you stand with the gods. Leviticus said, here, come, offer this particular offering, and then have a meal where you celebrate that you have peace with God. A brand new idea in human history. People lived with a profound sense of guilt. I've wronged my neighbor. I went and I made amends with my neighbor, but I don't know if I've made amends. Are the gods okay with that? And it's not raining, and there's some sort of disease, and we aren't able to have more kids. So is this the gods punishing me because I wronged my neighbor? My neighbor says it's no big deal, but is it a big deal to the gods? I don't know. The 4th and 5th offerings in Leviticus were, if you've done something wrong to somebody, either intentionally or unintentionally, come, offer this particular offering, do it this way, and then walk away knowing that the matter is over. The case is closed. You and God have peace. Leviticus, for us, appears barbaric, bloodthirsty. See, this is the problem with religion. It's so backwards. For the people who first heard Leviticus, this was so unbelievably revolutionary, so unbelievably progressive. People had never proposed ideas like this. Now, this whole system in Leviticus, these 5 offerings, began to build a head of steam. Thousands of people all over the world began to see and believe this is how you know God. Come, do what it says, follow the religious rules, and then you and God will be okay. And so this giant altar was built in the city of Jerusalem eventually. It had a giant temple behind it. The first one that was built by King Solomon was destroyed, not part of the plan. King Herod eventually rebuilt a giant one, 2.3 million stones. The altar had thousands of priests who took turns in a very complicated rotation system. They would come and assist you as you entered into the temple area to offer your sacrifice, because they said that this is how you know God. Historians estimate that at the spring Jewish festival of Passover, there would be 200,000 to 300,000 pilgrims who would come to the altar in Jerusalem to offer a sacrifice. There would be lines hundreds of feet long, thousands of people with whatever it was they were going to place on the altar. They said that the altar had a drain that went into the Kidron Valley and river that would run red at feast time, because so many people were coming, offering some sort of sacrifice, generally blood, on the altar, because they understood that this is how you know God. Now, there was a whole group of people called the Sadducees who ran this whole altar system. And they received a portion from all of the offerings that people brought. These Sadducees, over time, became very, very wealthy. They have found, archaeologists, they've excavated bottles of wine in first century Sadducee homes that in our day and age would be worth $5,000. So these people who ran the whole altar system were very, very wealthy. And the system, of course, worked for them. The masses are starving, but this system made them very rich. Now, it was a system, let's be honest, built on violence. Shed the blood of some animal. It's a violent act. And it said, and then you and God will in some way be at peace. And so for the Sadducees, anybody who threatens this system, well, that just can't be. And so the Sadducees had strong relationships with the Roman army. Essentially, they had violence at their disposal. So if you threaten this system of violence, we will protect it and preserve it with our own violence. Now, several thousand years ago, a Jewish rabbi named Jesus stormed into the temple area and announced, "One greater than the temple is here." To which I assume somebody said, and who would that be? He charges in and says, "One greater than the temple is here." Jesus' insistence is that whatever was happening through him was in some way greater and better than this whole altar temple thing. This was an absolutely astounding claim to make. He then makes a whip of cords, charges in at one point, and he drives out all of the money changers. Now we think whip of cords sounds a bit like a temper tantrum, but you have to understand that in our culture, if we want to make a very revolutionary statement, then we give a lecture and we have 3 points that all start with the same letter. And people are like, wow, amazing. But in Jewish culture, you wouldn't just lecture people to death, especially among the prophets of which Jesus came from a long line of, no. What you do is you do some sort of dramatic guerrilla theater. You do some sort of dramatic gesture, which was like a living, breathing sermon. So when Jesus comes in and drives out the money changers, he's essentially saying to the people of his day, in language they would understand, this whole thing is condemned. It's irrelevant. There's a whole new thing on the scene, and it's greater, and it means this whole system is over and irrelevant. I mean, if you're a Sadducee, you don't particularly like this message. And there are 4 accounts of Jesus' life. One of them, the gospel, the account of John, he tells about Jesus, says that Jesus came into the temple area, and Jesus said, destroy this temple, and I will rebuild it in 3 days. To which somebody in the crowd, some sort of Captain Obvious, said, excuse me, but it took like 46 years to build, so we're a bit fuzzy on how you're going to work out that math. And then John says, what you have to understand is the crowd really didn't get what he was saying, because what Jesus was saying is he was saying destroy the temple. When he said temple, he was referring to himself. So Jesus charges in to the temple area, says something greater is happening. It's happening through me. He brings condemnation and judgment. This whole thing is irrelevant. It's the old thing. And then mystically identifies himself with this whole system and says, destroy this. So kill me, destroy this, and 3 days later, something new will come into being. Something so fresh, something so great, it will render the whole old way obsolete and irrelevant. Well, we've seen that. I mean, the story of Abraham was absolutely mind-blowing for the people of its day. The story of Abraham was essentially pulling its culture forward. For many people, the thought of the scriptures is, well, these are these old, outdated stories that essentially yanked people back into the dark ages. The story of Abraham was so progressive, so aware, so enlightened. It was literally pulling culture forward faster than it could even handle it. The book of Leviticus, you can know where you stand with this God. You can have a peace meal with this God. So unbelievably progressive and radical, people couldn't even comprehend the extent of its greatness. And then you have Jesus. We've seen this story before. He's pulling the whole thing. Something greater is on the scene. Well, if you're the Sadducees, you don't want something new. The Sadducees made lots and lots of money off of religious fear and guilt. Totally unlike the world we live in. And so they killed him. Because if he's allowed to continue, well, he could bring down the whole system. And they have a vested interest in the system working. And so the system must kill him, otherwise he could be its downfall. Now, something very, very interesting happens on the way to his death. He's killed on a Roman execution stake called a cross. The Romans had become very good at inventing ways to make people miserable as they killed them and kept them alive as long as possible as an example to everyone else. You try and subvert or take over the system or rebel against the system, this is what will happen to you. You'll find yourself on a cross. Well, there are these moments on the way to the cross when Jesus experiences injustice after injustice. They come to arrest him with swords and clubs because he's so frightening. And one of his disciples pulls out a sword and starts swinging. And Jesus says, "Put away your sword." At every juncture, he responds with non-violence. Why? Because the altar was a place of violence. And it was protected and preserved by the Sadducees, who used violence. They had an army at their disposal to quell or crush anybody who threatened the system. If Jesus, in his path to the cross, at any point resorts to violence, is he then offering anything new? That'd just be the same old violence we've seen. He's ultimately, in his death, asking extremely profound, provocative questions about the very nature of the altar itself. His nonviolent resistance to a system based on violence was essentially his way of saying, what is your God like? Does your God need you to kill something so that your God can love? Is your God somewhere in a bad mood, and then you shed some blood, and all of a sudden your God says, "Come here, I love you, buddy"? How does this work? What is your God like? Does your God need you to hurt something so that you and your God can have a relationship? What is your God like? Because everybody has a God. Those who say, "I have no God," that's a particular kind of God. What is it that you trust? What is the ground of your being? What is it that you tread upon? What is it that you trust to be the deepest truths about how reality is at its deepest level? What is your God like? I had a meal with this businessman several years ago. I had known him around town, and we eventually had one of those, hey, we ought to get together sometime and actually, have more of an extended conversation. And so we met at this restaurant, and we started talking, and he seemed exhausted. Like, I barely knew him, but I was like, this guy is just barely hanging on. And I said, well, tell me about yourself. Tell me a bit of your story. And he says, well, I work several jobs. One of them is an hour away. He says, I drive all the time. He says, I work and I work and I work and I work. And as he began to tell his story, he told about how when he first met his wife, he said, my wife's parents were terrified that I wasn't good enough for her. And then he told about where his in-laws live, very nice, expensive part of town. And he says, my in-laws, who are now my in-laws, were always terrified that I wouldn't be able to provide a standard of living for their daughter that they believed their daughter deserved. So he says, I decided I was going to buy my wife a house near her parents to prove that I'm good enough. So he says, I bought her a house right near her parents. And he says, just to keep this lifestyle up, I have to work, and I 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 work. And he says, that's why I'm just killing myself, is I have to prove I'm good enough. So I'm listening to this sophisticated, modern businessman, and I had this thought, like, how primitive. Like it's as if this guy is bowing down to these gods, and he doesn't even realize it. The gods of success, achievement, ambition, acceptance, validation. I mean, this guy is killing himself for these forces that he can't keep happy. A couple of weeks ago, I ran into 3 women in one day who cut themselves. The one said she cuts herself because of the pain, the stress of family, work, school, and she said, I just get numb from the stress and worry. She said, I can't feel anything, and cutting is like a way to feel something. The other one said, she spoke of the pain, and at one point I just said, show me where you cut yourself. And she said, no, I cut myself on my legs. That way I can wear pants and no one will know. And the third, she said, my mom always says to me, you embarrass me. And then she said, and my dad hates me. And I was like, no, your dad doesn't hate you. And she's like, yeah, my dad says to me, I hate you. Kind of failed pastor moment there. God loves you and has a wonderful plan. The prophets of Baal cut themselves 3,000 years ago in the land of Canaan. And now this girl who's in high school takes part in a ritual that's thousands and thousands and thousands of years old. I ran into this guy, he's probably in his mid-20s. I've known him for several years. I ran into him probably 6 weeks ago, and he's like, aren't you going on some sort of tour? What's that thing called? And I was like, the gods aren't angry. He's like, they are with me. I was like, where does that come from? I mean, this guy is like mid-20s, and he's a citizen of the most technologically advanced society in the history of humanity. And he hears the gods aren't angry, and his gut response is, they are with me. What is that about? Several years ago, I ran into this high school kid I know, and he says, Rob, I am barely hanging on. He says, my good friend attempted suicide. And he says, so the past couple days, since then, I've been sitting with him. He says, I don't have anything more to say. And eventually he said, would you go visit him? So I went to visit this kid. And I visited him at this kind of mental health care hospital facility place. And they take me through, and you go past the nurse's station into this room. And this kid I've never met before. And hi, how you doing? I'm Rob. What's your name? And he has this bandage on his shoulder that like goes down his arm. And I said, apparently you've had a rough few days. Tell me what you've been up to. And he says, I have these huge gambling debts. And he says, the people who I owe all this money to are coming after me. And I didn't know what to do. And he says, I couldn't tell anybody. I couldn't tell my family or my friends. That it's like the shame of admitting that kind of mistake or failure. So he says, I came to this realization, I just have to end my life. So he says, my friend's parents were out of town. So I went over to their house, and they have a hot tub. And I got in the hot tub, put my feet in the hot tub. Before I did that, I took a toaster, and I plugged the toaster in, and I set it down next to me on the edge of the hot tub. And then he says, I filled my system with alcohol, and I slit my wrist so the blood would flow. But he says, the problem is I filled my system with too much alcohol, and I passed out. And instead of having time to throw the toaster into the hot tub, I passed out and fell over on top of the hot toaster and got first-degree burns. No. See, some of you want to laugh, and I did too, so you're okay. I didn't know what do you do? Are you making this up? Is this true? He's telling this with this is actually what happened. And then he ends the story. He looks at me and he says, I can't even kill myself right. How does a 17-year-old amass that kind of guilt and shame? How does he get a cloud, a dark cloud over his soul that thick and oppressive that he comes to the conclusion it would be better just to end his life than to move forward in tomorrow and the next day? There's this writer named Vincent Donovan, and he spent time in the 70s among the Maasai. The Maasai are a tribe of people who live in sub-Saharan Africa who are famous for their resistance to all forms of modernization. The Maasai live in tribal units that go from place to place, a very nomadic existence. They live in dirt-floored tents, have a high respect for cattle, kind of every image you had growing up of the National Geographic family. This is kind of who they are. And so Vincent Donovan's living among them, trying to understand their culture. And he's interacting with people in one of the villages, the elders and leaders of the tribe, and he notices there's a man on the edge of the village who's not interacting with anybody. And then a little while later, he notices the same man, and the man doesn't have contact with any of the other Maasai. So Vincent Donovan eventually engages the man in conversation and says, how come you're on the edge of the village? You don't really take part in the life of the community. And the man says, well, he says, I did something terrible years ago. I committed an offense against my people. And he says, we Maasai, we don't have a way to deal with the terrible thing that I did. So he said, there's no real way for me back into the community. So he says, I essentially live cut off from my people. And then I met this woman several months ago who asked if we could talk, and she said, I have a question. She said, I did something terrible years ago. And she said, it brings me so much shame, and I have so much regret. And she says, this thing that I did, I can't get over it. It defines me. It's how I understand who I am. So not only, she said, do I like carry it with me everywhere, to define how I think of myself, but she said that then affects how I interact with everybody else. She says, I carry this with me everywhere I go. And her husband is standing next to her, and he's just nodding. I had this thought, like, she isn't the only one who carries this with her everywhere she goes. So we hear about the Messiah, and we think how primitive, how tribal, how backward this man on the edge of the village, and yet this woman is essentially the woman on the edge of the village. If your heart is beating, if your eyes are opening to the suffering of the world, you have to ask at times, do we have the same old gods and goddesses? We just call them by different names. I mean, we live in the most enlightened, evolved, progressive culture in the history of humanity, or do we? Or are there ways in which we are just as backward and primitive? Do we have the same angry, demanding gods and goddesses who are never satisfied? We just call them by different names. Now, the first Christians wrestled with the implications of Jesus resisting the system, insisting that this system was over and something new had come about, and then getting killed by the system, and then 3 days later rising from the dead. For these first Christians, this wasn't just a nice religious act by a good Jewish man for a nice little ethnic group of people. For the first Christians, Jesus resisting the system and then ending up being killed by it, but then being vindicated 3 days later by rising from the dead. For them, this was something that had to do with all of humanity. So as you read the New Testament, they're searching for bigger and broader ways to explain just what it meant for the system to kill him, and then for him to in some way conquer the system in return. One of the first people to really argue for this in a big, giant way was the writer of the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews is one of the last books in the Bible. Now, we don't know who wrote Hebrews, but whoever wrote Hebrews, she was brilliant. The writer of Hebrews says, at one point, he, Jesus, appeared at the culmination of the ages. I mean, could you get a better phrase than the culmination of the ages? I mean, she said, he appears at the culmination of the ages to do away with sins by the sacrifice of himself. So for them, his death at the culmination of the ages was some sort of giant moment in human history. There's a whole new thing that's happened, and everybody is invited to step into it. And this whole new era, or this whole new consciousness, or this whole new reality people could trust, was something to do with this Jesus who essentially, the writer of Hebrews says, offered himself. So his resistance to the whole sacrificial system essentially meant that he became the ultimate sacrifice that then did away with the whole need for that whole way of understanding how you navigate the forces. Another one of the first Christians, a man named Paul, said, oh, Jesus and his shed blood, sacrifice language, on the cross, this was God making peace, reconciling himself to all things in heaven and on earth. Now, in the Greek language, the phrase all things translates literally all things. That's actually how it translates. This was God making peace with all things in heaven and earth through this Jesus. I have a friend who knows, he seems to know all the most interesting people on the planet. If you don't have a friend like this, get one. He has these parties, and you go when he has these parties because you have no idea who you're going to end up interacting with. I went to one of his parties, and I'm talking with a gentleman who I'd never met before, and we began talking. Tell me a bit about your story. Let me hear about your story. And his story, basically the first 3 minutes of his story was, I grew up in Rwanda. My mother was barren, and after a while she had me. And a barren woman whose womb is open, that child is considered an anointed gift from the ancestors. Not a bad opener. You know what I mean? It's a couple clicks up from, hi, I'm Gary, and I work in accounting. So he says, you have to understand, he says, in my culture, in where I grew up, he says, among my people, a woman who is barren, well, that is essentially like the curse of the ancestors. But then when her womb is open, oh, he says, this is the child that does that is special. He says, I was anointed the priest of my family. So it says, my job was every week I had to gather something and offer a sacrifice to appease the spirits of our ancestors. And so he says, we lived in poverty. We didn't have much. So I literally would have to scrounge up a goat or a chicken or something to offer on behalf of my people to keep the spirits happy. He says, when I was a teenager, a man came to our village and said, you don't have to do that anymore. And if you can hear, he has this very crisp English diction. He says, and I argued with the man, what do you mean? And the man said, no, you don't have to do this anymore. You don't have to offer these sacrifices anymore. And he says, I was shocked. I mean, the outrage of this man's message. I argued with the man. I came back at him. What do you mean? This is how I appease the spirits of my ancestors. He says, the man insisted, no, no, no. He says, the man told me this story of a Jesus, this man, this divine son, who was some sort of divine representation, flesh and blood, but real. He says, this man, Jesus, the man insisted, had in some way offered himself so that no one would ever have to live like that again. And so his essentially shed blood was the end of that whole way of understanding reality. And if you could hear him, he just says, and I argued, and I protested, and the man would leave. He would come back. We would argue some more. He would leave. He would come back. We would argue some more. He says, eventually, I decided to trust this man's message about this Jesus. And so he says, I stopped offering sacrifices, and all of a sudden, we had animals. And so he finishes his story, and he says, and you know what the point of this story is. And I'm thinking, for once in my life, I do know what the moral is. He says, I always say to people, Jesus saves the goats and the chickens. These first Christians were essentially arguing for a whole new upside-down understanding of ultimate reality. Essentially, they were saying, you have lived for thousands of years with, what do I have to give to the gods? But this God has given something that puts an end to that whole worldview. Essentially, you have lived with, what do I have to offer so that I will have divine favor? Oh, no, you already have divine favor because of what's been offered. What do I have to do to make peace with the gods? Oh, no. This God has done something that makes peace once and for all. This Christ appeared at the culmination of the ages so that peace could be made between this God and all things in heaven and on earth. This was absolutely revolutionary in human history. No one had ever articulated this worldview before. The first people who heard this said, that's good news. Now, this, of course, raised all sorts of questions about the very nature of religion itself. The writer of Hebrews, at one point, on an especially brilliant rant, said, it's impossible, the text reads, for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. It's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. To which I assume a lot of people said, well, that would have been nice to have known a little earlier in the story. Then the writer of Hebrews continues. It's not as if the priest who comes into the temple and offers the same things year after year, day after day. It's not as if this endless ritual doing all this actually ever changes anything. It's not like people all of a sudden stop sinning. Year after year, day after day, festival after festival, following the particular calendars about when you're supposed to offer what. It's not as if, the writer of Hebrews says, that actually ever did anything. It's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. How do you begin to sort that out? Now, if you go backwards through the scriptures and ask, is this anywhere else? Do we see this insistence of the writer of Hebrews anywhere earlier? In the middle of the Bible are 150 prayers called the Psalms. One of them, Psalm 50, is written from the perspective of God. And the God voice says, if I was hungry, I wouldn't tell you, which is divine sarcasm. Very well done there. If I was hungry, I wouldn't tell you. What do you think? I need the blood of bulls and goats? The cattle on 1,000 hills are mine. So in Psalm 50, the insistence of God is, what do you think I need? Do you think this is for me? Like I need this? If I need this, I wouldn't tell you. And then the prophet Micah, at the end of the Hebrew scriptures, right before the New Testament, the prophet Micah says, do you think that God is pleased with 1,000 rams? Like, do you think if you came and offered 1,000 sacrifices of rams, do you think that God would say, oh, now I love you? And then the writer of Hebrews says it's impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. So in the Psalms, the blood is unneeded. In the prophet Micah's writings, it's not like that's what pleases God. And in Hebrews, it's impossible to actually do anything. Well, then what's it for? If the blood is not for God, then who was it for? The writer of Hebrews says, oh yeah, the sprinkling of blood, that was for your conscience, for essentially the human heart. The writer of Hebrews connects these religious acts with human need. For the writer of Hebrews, the point wasn't some divine being who said, if I could just get more blood, things would go so much better. It was human need for something that would in some way calm or soothe the human heart, the human conscience. Now, what is that about? The writer of Hebrews has offered brilliant analysis of the human condition. We are anxiety-ridden creatures. We worry, we stress. We get tapes that play in our head of how we're not this enough, we're not that enough, we're not spiritual enough, we're not righteous enough, we get messages that play deep in our psyche over and over again about all the ways in which we're pathetic and we fall short and we're worthless. And we have a way of holding on to things, of letting worry and stress and anxiety own us and cripple us. We have a way of allowing our failures to follow us everywhere we go, of allowing our shortcomings to define how we see the world. And the writer says, God understands this. And so you're struggling with this or you're struggling with that. The idea of the altar was you come, offer this, and then have peace with God. If you're just told, okay, peace with God, that might be a bit difficult. We have a difficult time trusting good news to actually be true. Are you with me? But maybe if you go through some sort of ritual, maybe if there's a little blood on your hands, then the reality will begin to sink in. For the writer of Hebrews, the blood was never for God. Oh, no. That's just to help humans live with, absorb, and trust the love of a God who just keeps insisting, trust me, trust me, trust me, trust me. Now this, of course, raises all sorts of questions about repentance. You will often run in religious communities and faith communities to the idea, if you would just repent, then God would. And so communities take on their own, if you would just step through these hoops, if you would just go through these 4 steps, then God would. But for the first Christians, repentance was never, if you would just do these things, then God would do these things. It was, do you understand what God has done? And you are now being invited to simply trust it. Repentance was never trying to get God to do something, because God has already made peace with all things. If you are repenting so that God will somehow show up and do something, you are bargaining with the wrong kind of God. For these first Christians, all that was left to do, as you became aware and awakened to the reconciliation of all things that had happened at the culmination of the ages, was all that was left to do was celebrate it, to trust it. Of course, you're going to live in a different way. Of course, you're going to reorder your life. Who wouldn't when they came to an awareness that peace has already been made at the culmination of the ages? If you're bargaining with God to do something, you're bargaining with the wrong kind of God. This, of course, raises the question, then what is the point of a ritual? I ran into somebody recently who apparently had missed church the previous Sunday. Turn or burn, I say. And what happened in the course of our progressively odd conversation was, when this deep, serious blot on their soul emerged, they offered some sort of kind of awkward explanation about, no, you don't understand, this fell on my house and the cliff and stop, too much information, don't need to know. But they came into the presence of Pastor Man, and all of a sudden had this tremendous need to explain why they had missed the church service, as if I have some sort of cosmic clipboard in my back pocket, and you will move from this column to this column later, and I can't speak for eternity, but it's not looking good. And later, as I sorted through why the encounter was so kind of, I had this like, wait, why do you go to church? Essentially to get God off your back for another 6 days? So that some sort of deep-seated anxiety will go away for another 7 days? Well, do you go do this so that somebody somewhere will be pleased? Well, that's the same old primal gods and goddesses. What is the point of a ritual? Whether it's a church service, whatever, what is the point of a ritual? The point of a ritual is to ground us, to open us up, to remind us, to tap us in to the peace that has already been made at the culmination of the ages through this Christ who offered himself. Any ritual, any religious gathering that merely piles on a whole new weight of what you aren't, what you haven't, what you aren't doing, what you're not good at, what all the ways in which you fall short. Any gathering that simply piles on the same old guilt, anxiety, worry, and stress is not a Christian ritual. I don't care what language it uses to describe itself. The only proper Christ-centered ritual is one that reminds you, that refreshes you, that awakens you, that opens you up to the God who has made peace with all things in heaven and earth through this Christ who offered himself. A friend of mine struggled with ending his life for an extended period of time, for years on end. He struggled with, why don't I just end it? And he would stare at his wrist and think, I could just slice right here and it would be over. Several years ago, he had an encounter with the resurrected Christ. In the depths of his pain and torment, he met the resurrected Christ who knows something about pain and torment. And he had this experience in which the ground of his being shifted from stress, from worry, from shame, to love, to peace, to trust. he had an experience with the resurrected Christ that absolutely profoundly altered the whole way he sees everything. Soon after that, he got a tattoo of a cross right here. And now, every time he looks down at his wrist, which was previously the place of temptation, there's too much pain. Nothing can be trusted. I ought to just end it. When he looks at this place that was previously the place of temptation, he is reminded of the peace that has been made, the reconciliation of all things that was made at the culmination of the ages. This cross for him has become a sort of living, breathing ritual. A friend of mine spends an hour each morning on a cushion in his house. He sits perfectly still. He invites the God of the universe to put him back together. He invites God to go into all the broken places deep in his soul. He invites the reconciliation of all things to take part deep in the places of his own pain. And then he simply asks Christ, he asks this Jesus to lead him that day in acting in the world in such a way that he'll bring that reconciliation to whoever it is that he comes in contact with. For some, it's a piece of art. For some, it's a song. For some, it's a particular place in nature. For others, it's a meal and a table full of the people that they love the most. For others, it's a table full of total strangers who desperately need to know about the reconciliation of all things. But the point of a ritual is it's anything that takes you back, that reminds you, that awakens you, that enlightens you, that opens your eyes to the peace that has already been made. Now, as we sort through these New Testament writers and the way they speak of Christ being offered as essentially some sort of ultimate sacrifice on some sort of giant altar, however they articulate this, as we see it, the first impulse is to think, well, then apparently probably all that sacrifice altar imagery is over. But perhaps what they're saying is, okay, enough, away with that, Jesus said something greater, so now we just leave that behind. But in a brilliant twist at the end, the New Testament writers take this imagery and they essentially hijack it, they co-opt it for an even bigger idea. The writer of Hebrews says there is one sacrifice left. There is one sacrifice that still does please God. That is to do good for others. The writer of the book of Romans, one of the first Christians, said, offer yourselves as living sacrifices. Well, a sacrifice is dead. So a living sacrifice already is taking this imagery and essentially hijacking it for some greater purpose. Now what is this about? Lots of people have a difficult time trusting that a peace has already been made. So when you become aware of this, when your heart opens up to this, when your eyes are opened, then you put flesh and blood on the reconciliation of all things. You act it out in living, breathing skin and bones for those who would have a difficult time trusting that this really is true. And when you do that, people may be able to then say, okay, I can trust that. Essentially, the New Testament writers say, offer yourself to the world as a flesh and blood example of what the reconciliation of the ages, the peacemaking that God already has done at the culmination of the ages, looks like in flesh and blood. I know this woman, she has 4 young kids, and several years ago, her husband told her about his girlfriend. And then soon after that, he told her about his desire to be with his girlfriend, to leave she and the 4 kids. And so he did. And she had no way of feeding the kids. She was about to lose her house. She was struggling with the very basic issues of abandonment. This man has left us with nothing, and he's not apparently going to be faithful in his responsibilities. And some people came around this freshly single mom trying to sort through how she was even going to go forward. She got a call one day from this couple who said, can we come over and just take you for a drive? And she said, sure. Okay, so they come over, they pick her up. They take this mom around the corner. She's about to lose her house, not knowing where she is going to spend the next few nights with her 4 kids. They take her around the corner to a house. They pull in the driveway. They hand her the keys and they say, these are the keys to the house, this house that we just bought for you. Would you like a tour? There's this couple, I know, unemployment in our area is very high right now. Lots of people struggling even to put food on the table. This young couple I know has been hit especially hard by this economic downturn. Another couple I know went to them and said, "It is unacceptable for us that you would have a difficult time feeding your family. So meet us, please, if you can, tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. And they named one of those giant big box grocery stores that you can get lost in for 3 days. So the next morning, this couple shows up, and this family said to them, this couple, here, we are going to feed you for as long as it's an issue for you. We have committed. So can we go through the store now, and let's just get you everything you need for now, and then when you empty your cupboards, just call us, and we'll come and we'll fill your house again." And so they proceeded to buy them $900 in groceries. And as the story was told to me, that family's minivan just limped out of the parking lot. My wife and I have some beloved friends who live very in tune with the reconciliation of all things. And they live just right across the street and through the alley from us. And our friend, she was on her porch one day, and a woman came down the sidewalk with 2 shopping carts filled with random assorted household goods and a couple of children. And my friend is very, very intuitive, had this moment of, I cannot let this woman pass. I have to enter into this story. So she came down off her porch and she said to this woman, what are you doing? And the woman said, "Moving." And my friend said, no, here. And handed the woman the keys to her car. He said, "Just use my car." And the woman came back a little while later, handed my friend the keys, and said, "No one has ever trusted me like this before." I went through a very difficult time several years ago. I was running, achieving, working, impressing, going. Had to show everybody that I was better, quicker, smarter, harder working. And I was just totally burning out. And if you stay a step ahead of the pain, then you never have to slow down enough to sort through why you're driven like you are. And I was losing the joy, losing any sense of passion for life. And a friend of mine who has been the kind of friend you dream you could have took me to lunch. And partway through the lunch, he said, "You don't have to live like this." I was like, "Yeah, I know. He's like, "No, you don't have to live like this." And I was like, "Oh, no, seriously, next week the sun will come out. I have a plan." And he's like, "No, you don't have to live like this." I was like, "Yes, okay, I get it, get the point. No, you don't have to live like this." I was like, "Come on." And then he said it again. He's like, "You don't have to live like this." And I resisted for a while, like, okay, this is just, I don't, and he kept going. And eventually I stopped resisting and I actually started listening. And he just kept repeating, "Rob, you don't have to live like this. You don't have to live like this. You don't have to live like this." And as he kept repeating it, "You don't have to live like this," it started to become like this beautiful mantra. You don't have to live like this. I realize now that my friend was fighting for me when I had no energy left to fight for myself. And he just repeated over and over, "You don't have to live like this. You don't have to live like this." There's a writer named Richard Selzer, a doctor, and he writes about his experiences with people in the most tragic, difficult circumstances of life, the things he's seen as a doctor. And he tells about this couple who the woman was in some sort of accident, some sort of tragedy, and her face was severely disfigured. She had wounds and scars, and his job essentially was to put her face back together. And in the course of it, she ended up with a very, very crooked mouth and a mangled face with all sorts of wounds. And so they had her face wrapped in bandages, and they had her in the recovery room, and they brought in her husband, so her husband would be there when the bandages were first removed from her face. Selzer writes that when they took the bandages off and her husband saw his wife's face for the first time, the husband bent down and kissed her crooked mouth. And then he said, "I like it." The writer Brennan Manning tells a story of a woman who'd been having visions of Jesus. And the local archbishop comes to find out more about this woman who's been having visions of Jesus, because we can't have that. And the Archbishop says, have you been having visions of Jesus? And the woman's like, yes. And he asks, and she's not backing down. So he said, okay, here's what I want you to do. Here's what I want you to do. Next time you have one of your visions of Jesus, I want you to ask Jesus a question. Okay. I want you to ask Jesus, what sins I confessed the last time I went to confession. And so she says, fair enough. So he leaves. A little while later, he hears rumors that she's been having visions of Jesus. So he returns. He says, have you been having your visions of Jesus? And she said, yes, I've been having a vision of Jesus. And he says, well, did you remember? And the woman says to the Archbishop, yes, I did remember. And then she took the Archbishop's hand in hers, and she said, I asked Jesus what sins you confessed the last time you went to confession. And Jesus' exact words were, I don't remember. And the woman took the Archbishop's hand in hers, and she said, I asked Jesus what sins you confessed the last time you went to confession. And Jesus' exact words were, I don't remember. And the husband bent down and he kissed her crooked mouth, and he said to her, I like it. And that girl who cuts, I had the privilege and honor of looking her in the eyes, and I got to say to her, you don't embarrass me. And the woman handed my friend the car keys back and said, no one has ever trusted me like that before. And the minivan just limped out of the parking lot. And the couple said to the single mom, would you like a tour? And my friend sat across from me, and he repeated, you don't have to live like this. 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 So may you come to see that he has appeared at the culmination of the ages. May you come to trust that reconciliation, peace has been made. May you believe that this God is not angry, because this God is love. Peace be with you. Thanks. Good night.